Welcome back to Musicians Edition. Today we are going to look at the bass drum. Now we haven't done any of this yet, so let's start by kind of talking about this drum. You can see it is rather large, one of the reasons why this drum is kind of difficult to play is because of its size. So we need to talk a lot about like muffling and positioning and stuff like that. That's a lot easier to accomplish on the smaller percussion instruments. So first let's kind of talk about the parts, right? So it's constructed very similarly to a bass drum where you have one head, it's constructed very similarly to a snare drum where there's one head on this side, one head on this side, right? And then we have tension rods that go around that hold the rim on top of the head. And then that pushes the head down and stretches it over the shell. And that's how we can kind of change the pitch of the drum by tightening and loosening these tension rods, right? And we play on one side and then the other side just resonates as we play on the playing side, okay? It's quite a bit different from a marching bass drum where you would play on both sides and you have it kind of harnessed to yourself. But today we're just talking about a concert style bass drum where you're only gonna play on one side of the drum, okay? A couple things that are really important about this. This particular drum is on wheels, so you can roll it around. It does have locks on the wheels, and many bass drums do. Most bass drums that have wheels will also have locks. You just wanna make sure when you're rolling it around that the locks are off. And then when you want it to stay put, you can turn the locks on the wheels. Usually it's some sort of switch or something like that that will keep the wheel in place. But you definitely want to make sure that you have the lock off when you go to move it. Otherwise you kind of strip that out and then it wears down and then the wheels don't really lock anymore, okay? So make sure the wheels are locked or unlocked depending on if you want the drum to move or you want it to stay still, okay? Another important part is you see this drum can rotate on this stand. This is really nice because you can change the playing angle depending on how tall or short you are or what kind of thing you're working on. But what's very important is that you loosen up this joint right here on the side so that the drum will turn freely, and that then when you get the drum positioned the way that you want, then you tighten it back up, right? So if I loosen this joint and I loosen this joint, then you see that the drum can rotate, right? I can turn it whichever way that I want to, right? And then when I get it where I want, if I like that angle, then I can tighten this back down so that it will hold it in place, all right? So now that we've kind of covered that, let's talk about then how we actually do position this drum, okay? So again, we loosen these guys up in order to let it rotate freely, right? Now, I don't like to play bass drum this way, right? Because it's a little bit awkward to stand behind it. Some people will kind of try to do that, and that comes from marching bass drums and stuff like that. But when you're playing a concert style drum, you don't have to worry about it being harnessed to yourself, so you can rotate it to give yourself a slightly more advantageous angle to play from, okay? Now, technique-wise, we want to think about just using the same technique we use on snare drum with this drum, okay? So if we can rotate it a little bit, then that will let us have a grip that's more similar to what we would use for snare drum, all right? Some people will play with the drum completely flat, and I like that too. If you're playing something that you need two mallets for, and you gotta play fairly fast, you just turn it all the way over to the side and then play it like a snare drum. I like to play, typically, if I don't need to play something real fast, I like to play with a little bit of an angle for a couple reasons. It lets me then muffle like with my knee if I want some extra muffling. And it also, I think it lets the sound project a little bit better to have the bottom head facing out as opposed to the bottom head facing straight down like it would be in this position. Okay? So I like to find something like this, I don't know, 45 degrees or so, something like that. That's the angle I like to play from, okay? Now, when we position ourselves, again, we talked about not wanting to be directly behind the drum, right? I kind of like to think of kind of lining up the center of my chest or like my sternum with the rim of the drum. I find that's a pretty good starting point, and then we can shift a little bit depending on what's comfortable, how long or short our arms are. It's a really good starting point to kind of put yourself at an angle to the drum and kind of line up the center of your chest with the front side of the rim here that's facing you. Okay? All right, so then we take our mallet, right? We'll talk about a mallet more, we'll talk about bass drum mallets a little more specifically in a second. But again, we want to position it as if we've been playing snare drum, right? We're gripping it the exact same way, and then we just turn it a little bit, and then we play with the exact same technique that we play on snare drum, okay? All right, and then while you're playing, you see I have a little towel here to give us a little bit of muffling, right? Since it's such a big drum, we typically do want to dampen it a little bit. Sometimes you do play with it completely wide open, but it's sometimes difficult to hear articulation. So I generally start with a little bit of muffling and then kind of adjust from there. So we can adjust muffling by placing our fingertips on the drum. Or then, like I talked about earlier, you can get a stool or a chair or something to put your leg on and then lean your knee against the head also if you want to dry it up even more, okay? Now, playing position-wise, we want to aim either very center or slightly off-center of this head, okay? Now, on a snare drum, we typically play a little bit off-center all the time. With bass drum being bigger, we can we can get some different sounds out of it based on where we place our bass drum. That's a lot more pronounced or where we place our mallet, excuse me. We can get different articulations on this drum based on where we place our mallet. And those differences tend to be more pronounced on a big drum like this than on a smaller drum like a snare drum. So I can place my mallet right in the center, or I can place it slightly off center, right? Off center is going to give me a little more body in the sound, a little bit less attack, a little bit less articulation, right? If I move all the way to the center, it's going to dry things up a little bit and give me more articulation or more of the beginning of the notes and a little bit less of the sustain of the notes, all right? So before we play this, let's talk about this mallet a little bit. So bass drum mallets are quite a bit bigger than snare drum mallets. There's a bunch of different varieties. One thing you do want to watch for on your bass drum mallet is that most of them will have a seam right here, okay? That's where the felt is sewn together, right? So there's thread or dental floss or something like that in there holding the felt on the mallet. Now you don't want to hit the head with that part because it'll sound a little bit funny, right? So a good way to to judge that is just to make sure that you can see the seam before you play, right? And I always check that when I pick up a bass drum mallet. I make sure I can see the seam and then go ahead and play, right? As long as you can see it, you know that it's not hitting the head. You're not going to get any of those weird sounds, right? Again, we grip this just like a snare drum stick, although it's a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier, so you kind of have to control it a little bit more with your back fingers and less with your fulcrum than you do a snare drum stick, just because it's big and heavy. All right. Now, there's lots of, like I said, there's lots of different varieties of mallets. Typically, we want to have some sort of covering, but there are some bass drum mallets that don't have a lot of covering. But typically, if we have something that doesn't have any felt on it, it's some sort of rubber or something like that that's not going to dent this head, all right? We definitely don't want to go playing a bass drum with snare drum sticks, right? One, it's not going to sound very good, but two, you can put a dent in the head if you're playing it with sticks, and these heads being so big are quite expensive. Okay, so let's play this drum. So when I approach, I'm going to position myself, kind of line up my sternum with the rim, right? Get my grip here. Think about playing a snare drum and just turn it sideways. I'm going to find the center of the head, right? I'm going to start with no muffling, and then I'll slowly kind of dry it up so you can hear the difference. So here's with no muffling. All right, and that's dead center of the head. I'm going to go slightly off center with no muffling so you can kind of hear how that sounds. Right? So you can hear dead center, we get a little more punch. A little more beginning of the note, a little less of the sustain of the note. Slightly off center, we get a little more sustain, a little less punch, a little less beginning of the note, a little more resonance. All right, and you'll notice after I play, when I'm trying to dampen the head, I dampen this side and also dampen the back side, because you'll notice after you play both heads are ringing quite a bit. If you just dampen this one, that one's gonna ring for a little while too, right? So when you get to the end of a piece or something, or you want the note to stop ringing, if you can, get your other hand around here and dampen both heads, okay? All right, now let's add a little bit of muffling and see what that does to the sound. So I've just got a little bit of a towel here, and I just have a clamp holding it onto the tension rod there. So I'm gonna drape that over. You can hear what that sounds like in the dead center. And you hear that kind of dries it up a little bit, and then I'll move slightly off center. Okay. Now, if I want to dry it up even a little bit more, I can put my fingertips here. I typically don't like to mute with or muffle with the palm of my hand. I find that kind of makes it too dead, and there's not really much sound to it at all. But with my fingertips, it kind of gives it just enough. All right. So, dead center, adding the fingertips, and then slightly off center, still muffling with the fingertips. Okay. Then another option is you can get a stool or something, a chair or something like that, and you can lean your knee against the drum. And you hear that dries it up a lot. So those are kind of the options for muffling. You can put a towel, fingertips, put your knee on it. When you muffle at the end of a piece, right, or you want the note to completely go silent, muffle both heads, right? Remember to always put the seam of the mallet up so you can see it, so you're not hitting the head with the seam, right? Think about playing in the center, slightly off center, depending on what kind of sound you're going for, and always using the same technique that we use for snare drum on bass drum, just turn a little bit to the side, okay? Also remember to always loosen the stand before you rotate it, right? Always unlock the wheels before you roll it, and then lock them again when you get it where you want it to be. So it's a good start on bass drum. In our next video, we'll play a couple of the pieces out of Essential Elements on bass drum.